depends on which thing I'm talking about. But I would say in the 90s percentile, usually even in the high 90s. And by that I mean you're going to look for a while before you find anybody who cares to reject it. Now, I'm saying this should be a scholar who has a terminal degree, has a respected position, has peer-reviewed publications, not just somebody on the internet taking a shot and they've got a BA in, well, I don't want to make fun of people's BAs, but they've got a BA in some field that has nothing to do with the subject. So it needs to be somebody who knows the criteria. And then I don't care how liberal they are or how conservative they are. I just want to say that word about these texts. I'm using these texts because they're critically received. This first one more than any text in the New Testament, most likely. And the second one, read the whole chapter that Bart Ehrman has on this in his new book, Did Jesus Exist? And he'll tell you how seriously he takes Paul's interview with the other disciples. We're going to get there. So that's the method I'm going to use, what I call the minimal facts method. And secondly, in the New Testament, Mike's already introduced this, in the New Testament, there are a number of passages that go by different little names. They're sometimes called creeds, confessions, traditions, sermon summaries, and they serve different purposes. Some of them are liturgical, some of them are doctrinal. But the New Testament community, and actually it was critics who found this argument, not evangelicals, there are dozens of these texts in the New Testament, and they're believed to predate the text in which they appear. That's why Mike said Philippians 2 is probably older than Paul. Sometimes they tell you they're citing one of these texts, and Paul does that here. Some of you want to question about some of these things. That's fine. We're going to leave time for questioning. I do want to say this. I'm going to save my last conclusion, and that'll just mean I'm going to be going to the Q&A before I give it, and then I'm going to cut the Q&A short with like about 5 minutes to go so that I can go back and give the conclusion to my lecture. Okay? You'll see. If you've seen this lecture before, you know the reason. But I want to make some comments about the resurrection of Jesus. How do we know on critical grounds that Jesus is really raised from the dead? And just a few, very, very few thoughts at the end about what difference it makes. Just a few comments by way of application. Okay, but I'm going to be using the critical method. I will not be assuming inspiration. I will not be assuming the reliability of the New Testament. In fact, again, Mike alluded to this in a couple places. The New Testament could be unreliable, and I could make every argument I'm making today, because that's how the critics use the New Testament. It's unreliable, but there's a fair number of good texts, so they'll use the good texts. That's what I'm going to do. And you could call this minimal facts method, you can call it the lowest denominator, lowest common denominator if you want to. And my argument goes something like this. I am not putting down inspiration or inerrancy or reliability. Nothing like that. I'm just saying if you could establish the resurrection with the lowest common denominator, how well could you do with the text that's either reliable, inspired, or inerrant? So don't think this is the method I use when I go to a church to preach. It's just different strokes for different folks. It's called a method. And that's what I do at state universities. So with that introduction, let me direct your attention to 1 Corinthians chapter 15. And I'm going to paraphrase this, but Paul says, first two verses, he says, when I came to you, Corinthians, I preached the gospel. And basically, he says, depending on what you did with this material, that determines where you are with Jesus. Well, he calls him Christ. What you do with this material determines, he says, his word, whether or not you're saved. What have you done with the material I preached? And if you've responded correctly, first two verses, you're saved. And if you haven't, you're not. All that in 2 verses. And then he says in verse 3, 1 Corinthians 15:3, he said, I delivered unto you what I received. Now let's just stop there. Sometimes if I'm at a state university, I'll say, you all hear those words? I gave you what I was given. And I can just see college students going, I'm just undergrad, but this doesn't seem real difficult to me. Move on. Go, no, 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 hear this. I gave you what I